morning with a concerning and blunt message from North Korea, which has threatened a nuclear strike on Australia. The warning from the rogue nation was sparked by comments made by our Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop.
The plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. We don't know anything more than that.
We don't fully know the details. There is one report that a plane has hit of the World Trade Center.
Nobody move. Everything's quiet.
In a shocking incident that has rocked the heart of the city this afternoon. What we know so far is that 4 people have been confirmed dead, more than 20 people injured during this incident. 4 of those are children who have been rushed to hospital. Witnesses have reported multiple bodies lying in the streets of Melbourne. Now this
has found our politicians need to cooperate, or Australia's debt could blow out by $100 billion.
It's not news we want to hear, but WA's jobless rate has hit its highest level in almost 14 years. It means that around 96,000 West Australians are now out of work, and there's more pain to come ahead of Christmas.
Australia's refugee welfare crisis. Millions of dollars of taxpayer money being spent, but is the system really working?
Advocate calls this a national epidemic in need of a national plan.
More kids than ever before are being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders.
There is a huge autism tsunami that is going to hit the state budget if they don't take steps to ensure that the kids are getting treatment.
Autism was virtually unheard of back in 1975, when the diagnosis rate was something like 1 in 5,000. But by 2002, that number had jumped to 1 in 150. Right now, it's closer to 1 in 68.
Unless we do something to prevent it, over the next 40 years, we're facing an epidemic of neurologic diseases on a global scale.
What I think the Australian people yearn for right now is a Prime Minister who they choose, not a Prime Minister who the faceless men choose. And whatever happens on Monday or next week, it will be the faceless men pulling the strings. And the only way we can get away from a government based on dodgy backdoor deals, deals done in the dark, is to have an election. Let the people decide, and that's my fundamental message.
Iraq continues to find a community of nations which must be addressed.
Presents a challenge which must be addressed. It is inherently dangerous
to allow countries such as Iraq
to retain weapons of mass destruction, particularly in the light of its past aggressive behaviour.
If the world community fails to disarm Iraq, we fear that other rogue states will be encouraged to believe that they too can have these weapons, these most deadly of weapons, to systematically defy international resolutions, and that the world will do nothing to stop them.
Former Prime Minister John Howard spoke on Sunday night about the failure of intelligence in the lead-up to the 2003 Iraq War.
When you discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction, what went through your head?
Well, I felt I felt embarrassed. I did. I couldn't believe it, because I had genuinely believed it, and it wasn't a deliberate deception. I was struck by the force of the language in the American National Intelligence Assessment late in November 2002.
So I came back to see him a few weeks later. And by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper. He said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today. And he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
He defined the axis of evil, meaning Iran, Iraq, and North Korea.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
putting Tasmania on the maps of news bulletins around the globe.
World record puts Tasmania on the map. From New York, NBC sought details from a Channel 7 newsreader. Not such a good idea.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think anywhere in the world with an event like this happening would be in a state of shock, and more especially, Tasmania is a very small state of Australia. You probably know there are about 7 or 8 states in Australia.
Now, back to this question of pictures. All this sloganising about world records and cringing about being put on the world map is a direct function of camera people being excluded from the scene. Television's terrified of having to communicate ideas, and particularly horror, with words. It's hardly any better with print, who are competing for the attention of a readership which is really a viewership. By Tuesday, the newspapers had pictures. Murdoch's Hobart Mercury treated their picture in a most extraordinary way, unfolding their tabloid format into a broadsheet front page.
This is the man.
Our Tasmanian audience has his face obscured, but not the Mercury's readers. In a facile and futile attempt to avoid being in contempt of court by prejudging the man's guilt in Tasmania, where he'll be prosecuted, the Mercury explained the picture thus.
This is the man whom Tasmanians want to face 35 murder charges.
This is the man who allegedly...
Did they think that loan allegedly protected them?
Who allegedly, calmly, chillingly, coolly and brutally stalked and gunned down men, women and children.
This man is Martin Bryant, 28, a man of mystery from the Hobart suburb of Newtown.
All 3 Murdoch papers distributed in Tasmania, the Mercury, Herald Sun and the Australian, showed the man's face. No doubt gambling that identification would not be an issue in any prosecution and, dare I suggest, assuming that the authorities would lack the courage to take on the most powerful media corporation on earth. As to that, we shall see. Launceston's Examiner had a better news picture, the man in custody and arriving at hospital, but...
Mr. Bryant's face has been blacked out for legal reasons.
For the mainland audience, this is the picture as the Examiner could have run it, but didn't.
The DPP, Mr. Damien Bugg, QC, placed all media outlets on notice yesterday that he would pursue contempt action against any broadcaster or publication whose coverage of the tragedy prejudiced the trial of the alleged gunman.
And if pre-trial coverage by the media in some enthusiastic desire to disclose as much as possible to the public results in a person being deprived of a fair trial, I wouldn't call it a legal nicety at all.
Since then, the DPP has given notice of prosecutions of the Australian, the Mercury, the Age and the ABC. Meanwhile, the Courier Mail thought it had a bit of a scoop of its own, a picture from the Newtown High School's yearbook.
A young Martin Bryant at Newtown High School.
Only it wasn't.
The photograph was not of Martin Bryant, but of Michael Robert Bryant of Hobart.
Who may not be prepared to settle for something as little as a 1-sentence apology, hidden between advertisements on page 2, 3 days later. But there's more to be said about News Limited and that photograph. First, it was run by every one of Rupert's Australian prints, the Advertiser, the Herald Sun, the Telegraph, the Courier Mail, the NT News, the Hobart Mercury, and of course, the Australian. And Tasmania can join us for the close-up. In no paper was there any fiddling with the picture. The eyes were shown thus, except in the Australian. There, the whites were painted in and the pupils were darkened. Result, the eyes of a crazy killer. An enormous number of people spotted the enhancement.
My wife Elizabeth and I were both employees at Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority and were both working there the day of the massacre. My wife Elizabeth was murdered inside the gift shop section of the Broad Arrow Cafe, one of 20 victims murdered thereabouts. I know that Martin Bryant was not the gunman at the massacre at Port Arthur. How do I know? The coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, wrote a letter to a number of survivors of the massacre informing us that Martin Bryant was not the gunman at Port Arthur. In the letter dated the 31st of January 1997, the coroner, Mr. Matheson, wrote, As a result of the outcome of the charges against Martin Bryant from the Supreme Court of Tasmania, I write to advise I do not intend to resume the inquest that I opened on the 29th of April 1996. I believe it is not in the interests of the family, friends or witnesses to again traverse the factual situation in a public hearing, particularly when any finding I make must not be inconsistent with the decision of the Supreme Court. Well, I thought long and hard about this statement and discussed the point with friends. You must understand that there were many other facts of the shootings inside the Broad Arrow Cafe that begged a proper, open investigation, including workplace safety issues and especially the issue of the emergency exit that were totally outside the issues of the gunman. It was the simple fact that the coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, believed that he could not make any finding that was inconsistent with the findings of the Hobart Supreme Court. That really stirred me. The Supreme Court can only make the finding of either guilty or not guilty in the matter brought before it. It follows that for Mr. Ian Matheson's inquest into the massacre at Port Arthur to make a finding inconsistent with the Hobart Supreme Court, then the finding could have only been Martin Bryant was not guilty of the charges brought before him. For the coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, to arrive at the decision not to resume the inquest into the death of the 35 people that were murdered at Port Arthur, the massacre due to this reason, which he himself provided, and the coroner must have been aware that Martin Bryant was not guilty of the serious offences which produced 72 charges against police brought against him that day.
His column on Saturday was headed,
"Nothing but a bullet for Bryant."
and what followed was the sort of thing you'd hear from a lonely drunk in the corner of a public bar, raving to himself as everyone else shrank away from him.
Our system of justice demands a trial for Bryant. Why?
It's called the rule of law, Mr. Cullen. We know you're not much impressed with it.
What more do they need to prove his guilt?
Due process and the consequent satisfaction that justice had been done.
It's a strange society in which we live. A madman kills 35 people and then society goes out of its way to make sure all his rights and privileges are observed for a fair trial. Sickening, isn't it?
Cullen is a powerful argument against foreign ownership of Fairfax. Surely Conrad Black doesn't know he has an editor like that? Good night to you.